as we've talked about here, every state's a little bit differently, but when it comes to same-sex marriage, it can become legal in a state through legislative action, and we're going to talk a little bit about New Jersey down the road here, where that's being considered a ballot measure, as it did here through judicial action. The track record for same-sex marriage when placed before the voters isn't great, with 31 losses. Iowa is slightly different in that changing our Constitution, as you discussed, takes a while. And you know, when do you think, maybe Kathie can answer this question first, when do you predict the voters will have a chance to vote on this, if they do? And then maybe David, your part of that question is, how is that going to affect people's opinions on this? What do you see as the rate of change?
Well, first of all, as far as how soon it will happen, I think that the legislature, the majority would have to change hands, probably, especially in the Senate, for this to get to the ballot in the first place. Senate Democratic leaders in particular have said that they're going to block a vote, and I think that there certainly will be efforts to bring it up in the legislature in the upcoming session, but I really don't see those succeeding, barring anything but a changeover in majority in the next election. Now, once a referendum comes up, it has to survive and be passed by 2 consecutive General Assemblies, which means one in let's say 2012 or 2011, and again after the next election, and then get to the ballot. So really we're talking way down the road.
What we saw in Maine, a state that if you were looking at that before the vote, you would probably have put your money on same-sex marriage passing. And there was a campaign run there, I think, based on the fact that there was this kind of newness to it. And there were a lot of, again, I'm going to state my opinion, so beat me down for this later, but there were some ads that were run there based on scare tactics. Oh, yeah. Number of lawsuits that were going to be filed, homosexuality being taught in school, and a lot of those things which were laughable in their face, but politically they were effective. Because it was a new issue. And that's what I'm asking you.
Yeah, right.
If you've got people, it's not a hot button issue, or it's not something that affects them every day, it's 2 years or 4 years down the road, can they still get scared?
Does it become, in a sense, the new normal? That is, it's the state of affairs, it's gone long enough, the world hasn't collapsed, suddenly everybody isn't all higgledy-piggledy, everything's fine. I mean, it's kind of Massachusetts in a sense, right? There were all these dire predictions of those who opposed same-sex marriage in Massachusetts, and of course they haven't happened, in my opinion. But more importantly, public opinion in Massachusetts has moved more strongly in favor of the status quo, which is same-sex marriage. I think, in fact, Iowa is a more conservative place, despite, and that's easy sometimes to lose track of when Democrats made gains through the entire decade in Iowa at every level, right? It seems like the state has changed a lot, but in many respects it hasn't. So it is a more conservative place. I don't know whether you keep that going over 2 or 3 years, which is what we're talking about at this point, at a minimum. And probably longer, really, because the Democratic majority in the Senate is so significant right now, it's hard to imagine, even in a bad year for incumbents and for Democrats, which 2010 is likely to be, losing that majority entirely.
Yeah, and this question comes from an audience member, and it plays in well to this, and they're asking, what you see in Iowa communities, and you may be able to answer that question. Since this decision, how strong would you say the opposition to equal marriage is? Do you believe there will be a strong effort to enact the constitutional amendment? And I think this plays a little bit into what you were saying too, and I'd like you to reiterate that about how Iowa may differ in that we have a very strong opposition movement where other states have a very strong movement to push this. But first, that question about what you see in these communities and what you kind of perceive as happening for a constitutional amendment.
Well, I think that First of all, if you look at where the debate has been, we have seen one special election for the legislature where this did play as an issue down in Fairfield, and there was money and advertising on both sides of the issue. Ultimately, the Democrat prevailed. It was a slightly favorable district, I would say, for Democrat, but not overwhelmingly favorable. And I think both sides came out of that thinking, you know, perhaps this is not going to be such a big issue in individual legislative races. And you know, when it comes right down to it, individual legislative races are a lot of times about who the candidate is, you know, what the local circumstances are, and it is hard to take a macro issue like this and make it the key issue in a legislative race. And so at least that one experience, I think, was looked at by folks on both sides as a test case. And so
some of those legislative races, you may hear less about this.
I think so. I mean, I think that there will be some races where it's more important than others, but it may not be a universal theme across the state. And, you know, as far as also what are people saying in the communities about it, you know, I think that people are divided about it. I do think people still talk about it. They still talk about it around the dinner table. They have, you know, perhaps more and more experiences where people they know are involved. And so, you know, I do think over time, people do see ways that it touches their lives, at least tangentially, but it's still not probably a prevalent thing where it's something that you have to think about every day.
But since in Iowa it takes action to change the law, does this take the gas out of that movement a little bit of people who want a constitutional amendment to limit marriage because it's not talked about at legislative races, or does it just push the balloon to another place? They talk about in gubernatorial races and other places.
Well, there are certain issues where the people in office like having the issue even more than they like resolving it, and we have seen that issue. We have seen that with, for example, the death penalty. It's good for raising money on a cyclical basis, but it's not necessarily one where there's enormous pressure from the people to resolve it. Whether this turns out to be one of those issues, I don't know. I mean, it is a volatile election cycle. We've got active races for governor in which this is an issue, and you know, it's very possible that the results of the election will force, you know, some sort of resolution one way or another. But you know, even if it's resolved in one way or another soon, I think it comes back. You know, it comes back periodically over time. It's not like it goes away if it's not on the ballot. At least, you know, I think that the religious movement, for example, takes a very long view of things. And
there's obviously an interest in the Republican primary to talk about this issue, but maybe less of an interest in a general election to talk about this issue.
Unless something changes, the general election is going to be about the economy.
Right.
I mean, there's just no two ways about it. Will marriage equality be one of the other issues talked about? Sure, because it can be used to motivate voters on either side, right? You can go after particular groups of voters, you can get them out and get them riled up and get them out there, and campaigns will always segment the voters and find the particular issues that appeal to one particular group. But the big picture, unless just, you know, all of a sudden the sun starts shining and everything turns out okay, is about the economy. And in that sense, I think that's what the voters are caring about as well. Iowans are clearly split over this, though. If you ask them, if you force them to give an opinion about the issue, they're clearly split. And I guess what I want to say, though, is about it coming back and coming back and coming back. It's a great fundraising issue for certain sides of it. It's much like other things like the death penalty or even abortion, what have you. But the long term, unless all of the polling nationwide is very wrong, or people under 30 change their opinions dramatically in the next 20 years, the long term is towards marriage equality.